So these are the things that we're going to add to our enemies up here. So we're going to add a little patrol so that it's not just chasing the player automatically. And then once we do that, we'll have to add some player detection so that it will know when the player is, in the area. We'll add something to react to a attack on the player if it gets close enough. And then we'll give the player a way to attack the enemy using the physics object that we have in the scene already. Keep in mind, again, that these are just different functions that I thought would be useful. But you may want to do variations of these, or you may want to have some parts but not others. And so just keep that in mind. If you have specific things that you want to do that are a little bit different or don't use these features, we can discuss how you might implement other versions of these. Okay, so we are going to be doing a fair amount of scripting in this one. I have a script example here that I'm going to be referring to if I forget, but it's not too crazy. It's just adding a few extra components. We are going to be adding to mostly just the enemy scene, but we may have to make some variations to other scenes as well. So we'll probably be jumping around from script to scene editing a fair amount, and I'll try to make sure that we cover everything. And we're also going to have to make sure that we use our layers and masks correctly. So keep in mind that the way we're writing the scripts in order to keep them very simple is that we're relying on objects not interacting with each other unless they need to. And we're using layers and masks to make sure that works. And so I probably have errors with that, so I'm sure I'll have a chance to demonstrate that. But that's the first thing that we want to kind of keep in mind when things don't work exactly the way we expect them to. Okay, anyway, let's go ahead and start working on our enemies. So I have a couple enemies in the scene. I've got this one guy over here, and I've got another guy over there. And what I want to do, instead of just making them chase the player automatically, I want to give them a little path to walk around. And then if they detect the player, then they'll chase the player. There's a lot of different ways to do this that add more or less complexity. I'm going to do it mostly through scripting, just to keep it simple. But you can create paths, you can create extra navigation areas. There's lots of different ways that you might, implement this type of feature. So to start, we've got our enemy over here. This is our first enemy. And I'm just going to give the enemy a little path to walk around, as long as it's not following the player. So we're going to make some changes to the script. So I'm going to open up this ghost scene. I have it called ghost, but you might have it called something else, and that's fine. And then I'm going to click on the script icon to open the script here. So one thing we're going to add to start is I've noticed this has happened in a few cases where we're calling this physics process before the scene is ready, we're calling functions on the navigation agent before it's actually gotten initiated. So we're just gonna add a quick fix for that. This isn't like, this just is a bug, but it doesn't actually break the game. So I've noticed this happening, but it usually doesn't actually create an issue. But what we're gonna do is we're just gonna create a variable called waits frame. And this is a Boolean variable. So it's either true or false. And we're gonna set it to true to begin the game. And then at the beginning of our physics process, we're gonna say if wait frame, then we're just gonna not do any physics. So that's just gonna mean that we wait one frame at the beginning of the game before we try to do any navigation stuff. So first I'm gonna set wait frame to false, which basically says, okay, we've waited this one frame, so we don't need to do it again. And then I'm gonna return. And I'm gonna put a little note here that says, no navigation in the first physics frame. Should I turn the lights off? Is that? Yeah, okay.
It's kind of hard to read. It's very dark because it's cloudy outside.
Okay. So this is just a little bug fix. This isn't really one of our new features. Okay, the next thing I'm going to add in here is a Boolean variable that tracks whether we're following the player or not. And so if we're not following the player, we can just ignore the follow player code. And we're going to use that while we build up the patrol, but then we'll set it later once we want to follow the player again. So I'm going to set a variable is following player. That's a Boolean variable, so it can only be true or false. And it's going to start as false. So we're going to assume at the beginning of the scene that our enemy doesn't know where the player is and therefore is not following the player. And so there's a couple of things I'm going to do here to make sure this works. So this update target location, this is coming from the nav mesh, and it gives the enemy the location of the player. So what I'll do is, if I'm not following the player, I'm just going to return before I set. So it'll just ignore. So I'll say if not is following player, I'm just going to return here. So return is doing a similar thing that it does here. It just basically says get out of this function and don't do any of the other code in here. So if we're not following the player, then we don't want to set the target location to the player location. And I'll add a note in here that says this gets the player location from the nav agent or the nav region. Okay, I don't really need to say this, that's obvious. Okay, so now if we run our scene, our enemies are not going to do anything because they're not set up to follow the player, and they're also not set right now to follow any type of patrol. So now we're going to work on the patrol. I've got some print message, some rogue print message that just says pick one. That must be from the pickable script. Okay, let's get rid of this. Hopefully that wasn't important, but I don't want to see that right now. Okay, so now let's set up our enemy patrol. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to set an export variable. So remember, at export exposes the variable to the editor so that I can drag and drop values or change values in the editor. And I'm going to call this patrol locations. And so this is just going to be a series of points in the scene that are locations for the enemy to go to in their patrol. And the type of value this is an array. An array is a list in programming. It's just a list of things, and it can be any type of thing. The thing we're going to use is a marker 3D. So marker 3D, we used this a couple weeks ago when we created the hand for the player. It's just a marker in space, so you can't see it. It doesn't really do anything. It's just a way of saying this is the point that I want to walk to. It doesn't add anything else into the scene. So when I click on my enemy, now you can see there's a new variable here called patrol locations. And this is an array, and we can add to it. Okay, so an array is basically just a list of any type of data that we want to keep track of. And so we can add as many patrol locations as we want. And the thing that's nice about this is we don't have to have a set number. You could have 2 locations, you could have 3, you could have 4. So let's actually design our patrol for one of our ghosts, and then we'll continue working with the code. Okay, so I want my patrol to be separate from the ghost because I don't want it to move with the ghost, obviously. But I want it to be inside this enemy's area so it's organized. So I'm going to add a node 3D here. Or I could just add a node. It doesn't really matter because it's not going to move. So I'll put a node here. I'll move it up here, and I'll call this patrol 1. And then in there, I'm going to add a marker 3D. And this is going to be the first patrol location. And my first ghost is over here. So I'm just going to take that marker, and I'm going to move it to where the ghost is. So the marker is kind of hard to see. It's just these little axes. But I'm just going to move it. The first location, it could be the first or last, or it doesn't really matter actually. But I want it to go back to where it starts. So just to make that simple, I'm just going to start with that as the first location. So then I'm going to add just a couple locations just for testing to start with. So I'm going to hit Command D. That makes a new marker in the same place. And now I'll just drag this over here. So I'll have the enemy walk straight forward. And then I'm going to hit Command D again. And I'm going to make a marker over here. And I'll hit Command D one more time. And move that down here. So this enemy is just going to walk basically in this box area on the side of the scene. So that's our first patrol. I'm going to go to the ghost, and I'm just going to add, we have 4 markers, so I'm going to add 1, 2, 3, 4 elements in our marker array. And then I can either click on here and grab the marker that way, or I can drag the marker over here. So the thing that makes an array convenient, I could just have like 4 variables to hold 4 markers, but then every time I want to make a new marker or change the patrol, I'd have to add a new variable and change my code. With an array, I can have a list of these values, and I can change the number in the list whenever I want to. Okay, so that's my first patrol. And so now I'll make another patrol for this guy. So I'll go look over here, and I'll select my enemies and make another node and call this patrol 2. And I'll add in a marker here. And I'm just going to move this marker to where this enemy is, approximately. And so that'll be the first point of the patrol. And I'm going to duplicate the marker and move it over here. That'll be the second point. Duplicate it again and move one over here. And then I'll make another one down here. So pretty much the same, just patrolling a different area. And of course I could add as many markers as I want throughout the scene. So then I'm going to click on Ghost 2. And I've got my patrol locations here. So I'll click on that. And I've got 4 markers. So I'm going to add 1, 2, 3, 4. If I was doing this for the first time, I would not add this many, because I would want to just test a couple times first with just one ghost and one set of markers. So normally that's what I would do. But in this case, since I already have them, I'm just going to go ahead and add these in. Okay. So now we've got our patrols for our 2 ghosts. So let's see if we can set these up. So I'm going to go back to my scripting. And so besides the patrol locations, we need to keep track of which current marker we're headed towards. So I'm going to use a separate variable for that. I'm going to call this patrol index. And in this case, this is just a number. So I'm going to do an int here. An int is just an integer. So it's just a whole number. And I'm going to set this to 0. So that's going to be our first patrol location. And this is not going to be exported. I guess you could export this if you wanted to set where it's going to start walking, but you can also just change the order. So we're just going to leave this as a member variable in the script. Okay. So we're going to use our patrol index to count through our patrol locations to set the target for our nav agent. And then when we get to that location or get close to it, we'll just cycle to the next location. So I'm going to make a new function to set the patrol location. And this is something that's going to happen in a few different places, which is why I'm adding it into a separate function. So I'm going to say set patrol location. This is a made-up function that I'm just creating right now. So what this function does is it gets the marker from the patrol locations array, and then it takes the position of that marker and it sets it to the nav agent position, just like this does down here. So first I'm going to get that position. So I'm going to say variable, or let's call this location, equals patrol locations. And then for an array, we use the square brackets to set which one it is. So we're going to say patrol index. And then from here, this is going to give me a marker 3D. And even though a marker 3D is basically just a position, it is an object. So we need to get the position out of that. And what we really want is the global position. So that's the position within the entire scene, not just the relative position, which would be probably the same thing because it's just in a node, but we just want to be careful in case if it's parented to something else, then the position will be relative to that parent. So we get the location, and then we just use this same code here. We say nav agent dot set target. Oh wait, what is it? Yeah, set target position, and then we set that to the location. So now we want to call this function when the scene starts. So to do this, I'm actually going to add a function up here, underscore ready. So remember, the underscore ready is just a special function that runs when the scene starts, but it just runs once. So we're just going to use this to set the initial patrol location. So all I'm going to do here is just set patrol location. And that's it. Oh, we might get an error there. Let's see what happens. I'm realizing we might get an error there, but I think this will work. So let's just run the scene and see what happens. Okay, we're getting an error. It is trying to move, but what's happening, the reason it looks like that actually, I think, is because it's already in the position. And so we need to add some code to detect if it's too close to the current location to cycle to the new location. So actually, if I set the patrol index to 1, just as an example, they'll probably start walking. Yeah, there we go. So you can see they're walking to their respective positions. But then once they get there, they just stay there, and they might kind of glitch out a little bit. Because basically, they are arriving at that position, but then, they're just kind of glitching out because they're right next to it, so they're still trying to move towards the position. So what we need to do is before we move our enemy here, we need to check to see if we're close to the target. So we can do this pretty easily. We're just going to say, so this is in our physics process before we tell the object where to go, the enemy where to go. We're going to say if navAgent dot distance to target. So that gives us how far we are from the current target, which is our patrol marker. And so we'll say if that's less than 1, then, well, actually, we want to be careful because at some point we're going to be chasing the player. So let's say and not is following player. So if we got close to the target, but we're not following the player, then we want to reset our patrol location. So what we're going to do is we're going to increase our patrol index, this number, to the next value. And this is something that you see in programming everywhere. Basically, we're just like cycling this number through our list. So we're going to say patrol index equals patrol index plus 1. So we're just going one further in the array. And then the thing that we have to check for is if we go too far, we'll run out of indexes. So what we want to do is check if we've gone too far. We say patrol index if it is greater than or equal to our patrol locations dot size. That's how many patrol locations there are. If that happens, then we set it back to 0, so we start over. So we say patrol index equals 0. So now that we have a new patrol index, we just set the patrol location again, and that will update that location. So I'll put a note here. If enemy gets close to patrol target, set the next target. Okay, I think this will work, although I'm getting an error here. Let's see if I can just clear that. Okay. Oh, I forgot to put if here. There we go. So if the patrol index is greater than or equal to the size, then we set it back to 0. So now we should see our enemy follow our little patrol setup. Okay, so now it's going around. And let's see if our other guy is doing that too. Okay. And then let's see if it goes back to the beginning and starts again. There we go. Okay. So that looks pretty good. It looks a little weird. This is another thing that was pointed out recently, is that the enemies don't face where they're going. So let's fix that real quick. Again, there's a lot of different ways to do this. I'm going to do this in a very simple way because I don't want to spend a ton of time on this. I'm just going to make the enemy look at the direction it's going. So the direction it's going is basically its current position plus whatever its new velocity is. So I'm just going to have it look in that direction. So there's a pretty simple function to do this called look at. This function exists in pretty much every game engine because you're always pointing stuff towards other stuff. So I'm going to look at our position, which is the position of the enemy, plus the new velocity. So what I'm doing is I'm saying look from wherever I'm standing to in the direction that I'm walking. And I think that should get our enemy to look in the right direction. Okay, but they're looking away. Let me check actually. Oh, I set it to the current location based on the nav. Okay, so I did this a little bit differently. We're using the current location from the nav. Or no, that's the same. Oh, okay. Oh, I see what I'm doing. I'm just using the global location, so that makes sense. Okay, so we're just going to use this current location that we've already calculated up here and add the new velocity there. That hopefully will look better. Yeah, so now the enemy is at least facing in the direction that it's walking, although it is just a donut, so it's a little hard to tell if that's the front or the back, but let's just assume that's the front. Okay, so we've got our patrol working. So now we just need to interrupt the patrol when the player enters into an area. So this is another thing where there's a lot of different ways to do this. I'm going to go over one basic way that I think is pretty simple and just uses stuff that we've already learned. So in their ghost, I'm going to add a little invisible collider that when the player runs into it, it's just going to make the ghost aware that the player exists, and it'll chase the player until the player leaves that area. So you can make this whatever shape you want. I'm going to add an area here. And I'm going to call this the player detect area. And then, of course, I need a collision shape for this to work. So I'm going to add a collision shape here. And I'm going to call, well, I don't need to name this. I'm going to add a shape here. And so this is what's going to determine sort of the way that the enemy dynamic works. So you can make it like a big circle. So that's more like it kind of like senses or hears the player. You could make it a direction. So it's more like it sees the player. Depending on how you set this up is going to change, how it feels to play the game. I'm going to use a box because it's just a simple shape. And I'm going to bring the box up here. and then I'm just going to make the box go out like that. So it's going to be basically like the player has to be directly in front of the enemy for the enemy to detect the player. You can add as many shapes as you want within the area. So if you want to have like one facing backwards or one facing up, you can really do whatever you want with this. The other thing is I think that this is behind the enemy. I shouldn't have used a donut for this because I don't know which way is forward and back. Let's go in here. Oh, I think that actually looks fine because it's facing forward. Okay. So this is our player detect area. And if the player goes in this area, then the enemy will start chasing it. And I can make it taller if I want it to be taller. I can change this to get whatever sort of detection area I want. So we need to make sure to use our layers and masks here. So I'm going to click on this area and scroll down to collision. And everything's always going to be default on layer 1, mask 1. So we do want to change the layer first. Everything should have its own layer for the most part. So we'll call this the player detector. And make sure to set this to player detector and turn off player. And then for the mask, we want to be able to detect the player. We don't really need to detect anything else. So we can leave the mask on the default. Okay, so now, and hopefully this process is starting to seem familiar because it's pretty much the same process for every thing that you add in Godot. Now we're going to add a signal. So if our player goes into this area, we'll trigger a body entered signal. So we'll take this signal and we'll connect it to our main Ghost script. And when I do that, it's going to create a new method, on player detect body entered. That's perfectly fine. I'll just click connect. And this is really simple. All it does is change is following player to true, which changes how our code works. We'll get the player position and we'll set that as the target position. Okay, so now we're going to say is following player equals true. And this is also going to ignore, since we have not following player here, this is going to completely ignore if we randomly happen to be near one of our patrol targets. So that's why we need to make sure to check that we're not following the player when we're updating our patrol. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. The next thing we need to do is if the player manages to get away, then we need to stop following the player. So we'll use body exited for this. So I'll double click on this and we have the same thing. I'll just hit connect. It adds a bunch of lines, but let's get rid of those. So this actually has to do two things. First, we're going to say we're not following the player anymore. So we'll say this is false. But now, since we were following the player, we stopped the patrol. So now we need to reset the patrol. So I'm going to say set patrol location, and that'll set us back on our patrol. So for all of these different events, another thing to keep in mind is right now, this is going to trigger the enemy to start following the player. But you could also make it do all sorts of different things. You could change the color of the player. You could play, or the color of the enemy. You could play a sound to let the player know that the enemy has been alerted. All of those different things could be part of this event. It just depends on what you want to have in your game. So let's add a sound in here just as an example. I don't have a sound for this, so I'll probably use, let's see. I guess I'll use my throw sound. Will that be too confusing? I'll just use that as an example. So I'll click on the ghost. I'll add an audio stream 3D. I'll call this detect sound. And then I'll throw a stream on here. So I'll click load. And I'll just use the throw sound for this. Or let's use a pickup sound. That kind of makes a little bit more sense maybe. Anyway, normally I would want to, have a separate sound for this. I'll set the volume to -12. Just, I think that'll be good. And so now I'll just play this sound when we detect the player. So I'll say detect sound dot play. So anytime you have an event like this, it's good to add a sound or some other thing that, adds to letting the player know that the event has occurred. Okay. So I think that should set our enemy to attack our player. Let's give it a shot. Okay, so now if I get in front of the enemy's area, it should start to attack me. Okay, so now you can see it's following me. But if I get too far away, it forgets about me. This guy's having an issue. Oh, you know what I think's happening to him? So I must have a collision layer set up wrong because it's triggering that guy. So let's double check my collision layers. So I'm gonna click on the ground first. Okay, so I haven't set my collision layers at all. Okay, so this is what I'm always telling you guys to do, but I'm also making the same mistake, so that's normal. So we need to set our ground to the platform layer. And then our ground does not need to interact with anything except the player. Okay, so that's all we need to change there. Let's look at our Pac-Man map. So for this static body, we probably have the same issue. Yeah, so let's put this on the platforms layer, and then we can make it interact with more stuff. So we'll interact with the enemies and the pickable, and that should be fine. Okay, so always make sure you have your masks and layers set up right. Uh-oh. Now I'm falling through the ground, which probably means I don't have my player mask set up. Let's take a look at that. I don't. Okay, I don't know why this is just set to defaults, but so the player needs to interact with the ground and everything else as well, except for itself. Okay, so now let's see if that fixes that. Okay, there we go. Okay, so let's test this enemy. If I get in his way, he's gonna start chasing me. Or maybe not. Oh yeah, he is. It's kind of hard to tell. But then if I get far enough away, he stops chasing me. Okay. Okay, so we interrupt the patrol, and the enemy follows the player. Okay, so we have two more components left. We want the enemy to attack the player, and we want the enemy, we want to be able to attack the enemy as well. So basically, we need to know what happens when the enemy arrives at the player. So there's a couple ways to do this. One is just to use our nav agent and just say when we get a certain, distance away from the player, that constitutes an attack. Or we can use an area to detect the player, just like we did with the player detect. So let's just use the nav for now, but either one of those solutions would be fine. So let's go to our enemy and or our enemy script. And so this here is detecting if we get to the next patrol target, but we also want to detect if we get to the player. So this is almost the same question, but it's formulated just slightly differently. If nav agent dot distance to target is less than 1, and 1 is just kind of a guess here. You might find, depending on the scale of your scene, that 1 is either too small or too large. You can change that. So if our distance to target is less than 1 and we are following the player, then we can basically decide what we want to happen here. Do we take a life away from the player? Do we reset the scene? I'm just going to do an end game just to keep it kind of simple. But you could do different things with this. So to do an end game, essentially what I'm going to do is I'm just going to boot the player back to the main menu. This is just to save time, but obviously you could have a separate menu that says you died. You could reset the level. There's a lot of different ways you could deal with this. So if you have a different method that you want to deal with, let me know and we can do that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is let's add another export variable and set the scene that we want to load. So I'll call this game over scene. And the type for this, let's go to our menu and remember what we used here. So I'm going to go to scripts and go to menu. And so we used a packed scene for this. So I'm going to go back to the enemy script. And so this is a packed scene type. And so then I'll go to my ghost guy. And I have... oh, it's not showing up. Do I have an error? Oh, I haven't finished writing this yet. So let's put a pass here for now. And we'll set our game over scene. So I'm just going to use my splash menu scene. But if you wanted to have, you know, your own a special game over scene, obviously you could use that here. And so now I'm just going to basically do the exact same thing I do in the menu, which is get tree, change scene to pack scene. So let's go back here. So instead of pass, I'll say get tree and change scene to packed. And then I'll put in the game over scene here. Okay, so that's just a very simple way of dealing with this. But again, if you have other things that you want to occur when you get hit by the enemy, you can program that, or we can program that together. Uh-oh, it looks like we got an error. No error. Let's take a look. Okay, so we might not be getting close enough to the player. Or maybe my enemy doesn't have... No, it has it. Okay. So let's print out the distance to the player. We might not be getting close enough. So let's say if is following player print nav agent dot distance to target. And it's kind of hard to see the... I can't see the console because the screen, the window is too big, but... Oh, whoops. We can go back and look at it. Okay. So... Oh, yeah, so it's not actually able to get close enough to the player to trigger this script. So we have to change this value to 2. I think that'll work. So you will have to test that. You know, there's probably better ways to calculate it. Like you could figure out how big the player collider is, but I'm just going to be lazy and just test this and deal with it later. Okay. So now if we hit the enemy, we go to this UI scene, and we can either start over or quit the game. So again, you can make it do whatever you want there, but that's just the simple solution that I'm going to use here. And actually, after we do that, we should return, because there's going to be some errors if we keep trying to move the nav agent after that. So let's return after we change scenes. We should probably do that here too, so we can set the location and then avoid any errors. So that should fix that. Okay, one more component to add, and then we're done, is if we want to get rid of the enemy by throwing our projectile, we need to make another area just to see when the projectile has entered the enemy area. So this is the last bit for this section. Okay, so I have my enemy here, and I'm just going to make another area, just like the player detect area, but this will be for detecting if the enemy gets hit by another object. So I'll add in another area 3D. I'll call this the Hitbox. And I'll just add a collision shape here. And for this, I'm just going to use a box. doesn't really matter how accurate this hitbox is. I just want it to be, you know, relatively accurate. So I'm just going to squish it a little bit. And as long as it's somewhere inside of the art or the mesh for the enemy, it should be fine. It doesn't really matter if it's exactly perfect. Okay, so then the hitbox needs its own layer. So I'll go to collision and add a new layer name. I'll call this enemy hitbox. And so I'll put this on the hitbox layer, turn off the player, and then this is only going to interact with our pickable, which is what we're going to throw at it. And so now we can set another signal from our hitbox to our enemy script. So I'll click on the hitbox and go to node, go to signals, and if a body enters here, we'll connect it here. And if this happens, we're just going to remove the enemy from the scene. So this is another thing where, you know, you could play an animation, you could play a sound. There's lots of different things you can do here. But for me, just for the demo, I'm just going to remove this enemy. So I'm just going to say queue free. And it's just going to disappear. It's not going to be super satisfying, but, you know, it'll do the trick. So I think that's all I need to do. But before I run into an error, let's make sure our box is on the right layer. So let's go to collision. So the box is on the right layer, but let's also make sure that it's masking for the enemy hitbox. And so now we should be able to get rid of the enemy. So I need the hitbox, or the pickable. I'm going to grab this, and let's see. If I just actually run into the enemy, it should kill it. There we go. Or if I throw it, oh, I missed. Okay, let's go grab it. There we go. Okay, so if it hits the hitbox, it disappears. So again, this may not be the exact interaction you want, but if you want to, if you want to change this, you can change what happens when the enemy hitbox gets hit. You could do it there. Okay, so that's everything that I want to add. Most of these changes, if we go over to GitHub, we can see the changes here. So most of these changes happen to this enemy script. I did make some changes to the ghost scene. I just deleted this, so I didn't make any changes to the pickup script. I really only changed the enemy script and then made changes to the scenes. So I'm going to say adds patrol enemy, or let's say adds enemy patrol, hitbox, and player attack. So I'll push that to GitHub. And so you guys can grab that from the game template. If you go to scripts and look at the enemy script, this is where all of these changes happen. And you can implement those in your scene. Obviously, again, just implement the ones that you want. You can ignore the functionality that you don't need. All right. Any questions or anything you guys want to review?
Yes, can we make the interaction enemy player? Because after this moment we are killing the enemy, but the enemy is not killing us.
Oh, the enemy does kill us, but when it kills us, I'm just going back to the main scene. So that's another part where I'll put a note here. So enemy attacks
Respawn point.
player. What?
Just going back to the respawn point.
I'm going back to the main menu. But you could swap that with another menu item, or you could set the player back to the respawn point. You could just reload the scene altogether, which would be kind of the same thing.
Yeah, because I mean, what I meant by that is like, if you get killed, you should lose all the elements that you have already collected.
Yeah, so that's another thing that you could script. Like you could say like, global dot item, or I think I called it apple count equals 0.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, so things like that, you would have to script them. So it's not going to be the same for everybody. So if you have specific features or things that you want to happen when the enemy gets attacked or loses the level or whatever, then we can script those at that point. All right,